Well, welcome back to this panel on contemporary Ismailism, part one, which I'm honored to chair. Let's proceed directly to the talks, and we'll begin with Dr. Zulfikar Hirji from York University, who's joining us from Toronto, I think, online, who's speaking on Ismailis and Ismailism in Africa, scholarly approaches, emerging debates, and new directions. So, over to you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Terrific. Thank you very much, and good morning from a very cold Toronto. I wish I was in the warm wilds of the Institute of Ismaili Studies conference, and thank you for the kind invitation for me to present to you virtually here today. I want to begin by just acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional lands of many different Indigenous communities here in Canada. The academic study of Islam and Muslims in Africa, particularly in regions south of the Sahara, remains at an early stage. The reasons as to why are beyond the scope of my paper, but it certainly relates to the racialization of knowledge production and Arabo and Perso-centric views of Islam that took hold in European colonial contexts and filtered into Western academia. For its part, Ismaili studies has also paid little attention to Ismailis in Africa. But there is a caveat. Some eras of Ismaili history, such as the Fatimid, unfolded on African soil. Histories typically examined through the imaginaries of the Middle East and the Mediterranean. So I would like to ask what it would mean to study the Fatimids as an African empire, considering the extent to which Fatimid imperial ambition was realized on the backs of Amazigh, Sudanese, Ethiopian, and Nubian African soldiers and slaves. That some of the empire's celebrated courtly wealth was made from distinctively African materials, including rock crystal and ivory, and that Sayyidah Rasad, the mother of the 8th Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Mustansir, was a slave concubine of African origin and ruled the empire as regent in her son's name for some 30 years. Now, this provocation aside, my concerns today do not center on the 2 centuries of Fatimid rule in Africa, but on the some 6 centuries during which Ismailis from South Asia engaged with, migrated to, and lived in Africa. Having been part of the maritime world of the Western Indian Ocean for some, excuse me. Having been part of the maritime world of the Western Indian Ocean from at least the 16th century, South Asian Ismailis of different linguistic, doctrinal, ethnic, and caste persuasions, alongside South Asians of other backgrounds, migrated from the Indian subcontinent to Eastern Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries, and established seasonal and permanent residences and communities. Their number grew during the latter half of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Their movements prompted by famine in India, European colonial indentured labor schemes, chain migration, and advice from their respective religious leaders. And it is important to keep in mind that the Ismaili 600-year history in Africa is connected to the histories of its religious leaders, institutions, and outlook. I'm hoping you can see the slides on the screen. I didn't check to ask.
Yes, we can. Yeah, we can.
Thank you. By the mid-20th century, prior to European decolonization and African independence, large numbers of Ismailis were established throughout Eastern, Southern, Central, and West Africa. Post-independence, they were part of nationalist struggles and further waves of decolonization. In time, some Ismailis moved from Africa to other parts of the world. These voluntary and forced migrations resulted in the dissolution of some historical communities and the reconfiguration of others. And in the 21st century, Ismailis in Africa include the descendants of earlier waves of settlers, as well as recent migrants from South Asia and other parts of the world. And today, they're all part of transnational and global Ismaili communities. Now, with this historical outline in mind, my paper has 2 parts. The first offers observations about the current state of scholarship on the Ismailis in Africa in terms of approaches, frameworks, and sources. And the second draws on my ongoing research on photography of the Ismailis to critique the state of the field and propose new scholarly pathways. The academic study of Ismailis in Africa has been largely carried out by historians and sociologists of East Africa interested in Indian, Asian, or Muslim migrants, and a few scholars interested in aspects of Ismaili history. Most scholarship is in English, with some studies in French and Portuguese. There is more research on the Ismailis who settled in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. Other locations, including Mozambique, Madagascar and parts of South, Central, and West Africa have received far less attention, and most studies focus on the 19th century onwards. In terms of primary sources, scholars have relied on a great deal on European colonial accounts of their African colonies and protectorates, such as field reports, gazetteers, policy papers, official correspondence, and legal documents. Such sources mention Asiatics, Indians, Boharas, Khojas, Ismailis, followers of the Aga, etc., often with a view to delineate and differentiate their origins, distinctive traits, and habits. In recent years, historians and social scientists are collecting and using other sources, including oral histories and community records. There has, however, been a limited use of sources such as architecture, clothing, objects, family papers, and photographs. One of the main characteristics of scholarship is that they have been produced within the framework of Asian history in Africa. And like the colonial records on which it often depends, Ismaili groups are presented as homogeneous ethno-religious communities with shared and uncontested histories. Scholarship has also adopted a geographically delimited approach, which suggests that once having migrated to Africa, connections to India were severed. This communitarian view, in which all individual identities and histories are seen to be fully and only shaped by intercommunal relationships and trajectories, mimics what may have suited European colonial preoccupations with governability and productivity. As such, Ismailis are often presented as industrious, compliant, and enclaved colonial subjects and cooperants. Ironically, such impressions may have been what Ismaili leaders asked their followers to aspire to, or how they wanted their followers to be perceived. But such aspirations and perceptions may have been necessitated by the colonial context, which operated on asymmetrical power relations, as well as divisions based on origin, race, skin color, ethnicity, religion, class, and vocation, among other factors. Studies squarely focused on Ismailis in Africa are of three types. The first is of the chronicle variety that outlines the sequence of events that led to Ismaili migration and settlement in Africa. Often following a dynastic approach, the focus in these studies often switches from the history of Ismaili followers to its religious leadership and institutions. Also adopting a communitarian view, these chronicles contain little about the experiences or outlooks of particular community members and very little contextual study of religious practice. Furthermore, the focus is on urban centers rather than rural communities. The second type uses conceptual frameworks to analyze socio-historical shifts, including ideas of tradition and modernity, and adaptation and change. The tendency, again, is a communitarian view, and in some cases, it is difficult to tell if such paradigms are models for rather than models of Ismaili experiences. The third type are studies of Ismaili individuals, particular regions, institutions, and historical events. These are more source-critical studies that make judicious use of oral histories, family documents, and legal sources. Of particular concern is 19th century settler history, particularly of Ismaili men. As such, there is a gender bias in such works, which also characterizes the subfield more generally. In recent years, the significant gaps or biases in scholarship have prompted Ismaili community members to produce their own accounts and publish them online, such as on online sites such as KhojaWiki, Simurg, Baraka.com, and Ismaili.net. Indeed, an important feature in the study of Ismailis in Africa is the symbiotic relationship between academics and non-academics. Now, I personally regard this relationship to be a rich space for collaborative knowledge production and data collection, notwithstanding the challenging conversations about discrepancies between scholarly findings, official accounts, inherited narratives, and personal memories. I am aware that this potted overview does not reflect all scholarship. My aim has been to point to some overarching proclivities in order to advocate for more source-critical and source-inclusive approaches. Admittedly, in recent years, while trolling the many online self-published histories of individuals or families, I have been asking myself, how much do we really know about the histories and life worlds of Africa's Ismailis? I want to visualize this for you in this question, or an answer to this question, by showing you the geographical spread of Nizari Ismaili communities in Africa in 1946, using a list of provincial councils in the Ismaili Constitution, Rules and Regulations that was published in Mombasa. The document lists 18 provincial councils responsible for the administration of Ismailis residing in 401 towns and villages. Now, read as a map, the list provides us with a footprint of the Nizari Ismaili presence in Eastern Africa during the late colonial period. The 401 towns and villages are dotted along some 4,000 kilometers of Eastern Africa from Lamu to Cape Town, which incidentally is the same distance between Cairo and Dushanbe. While population numbers are difficult to determine, based on rather conservative calculations, I have estimated that in 1946 there were around 60 to 70,000 Nizari Ismailis spread throughout Eastern Africa, which is approximately 10,000 families or households. I should also note that at this time, various parts of Africa were ruled directly or indirectly by European powers, including Britain, France, Belgium, and Portugal, all of whom had imperial and colonial governance practices that penetrated the lives of indigenous and migrant populations, including the Ismailis. Additionally, it is important to recall that the places in which the Ismailis lived were inhabited by diverse indigenous African populations that had rich histories that long predated colonial rule and with whom Ismailis had various relationships. Based on the 1946 list, it would not be a gross overstatement to suggest that hitherto scholarship has told us very little about the histories, life roles, and the complex sociocultural context of Nizari Ismaili communities, families, and individuals, and perhaps the same could be said of the Bohoras. Returning to my late night trolling, my other observation has been that alongside their personal and familial narratives, Ismailis who once lived in Africa are posting a vast photographic record of their histories. This is surprising to me because in 2008, when Dr. Dafri and I put together the illustrated history of the Ismailis, very few images were accessible at the IIS or from individuals. In my research, I have now come across many individuals who said they have deposited their photographs at the IIS. So, Dr. Mohammad, if you're in the audience, I look forward to revisiting the IIS's Ismaili Special Collections to study its growing photographic collection. It is worth recalling that owing to the introduction of photography in the mid-19th century, we have an unprecedented visual archive of the Ismailis from then until the present day, which requires critical scholarly attention. Thus, in the second part of my paper, I draw upon my current research project on the photographic record of Ismailis in Africa, which also focuses on the Indian Ocean. This research is based on family photographs in private and public collections and uses methodologies and theories from history and anthropology, as well as scholarship on photography in South Asia and Africa. Drawing particularly upon Diana Taylor's theoretical work on archive and repertoire, I am thinking about photographs as historical evidence, but also as historically situated performative acts through which the Ismailis created themselves through embodied forms such as dress, gesture, position, gaze, and assemblage, as well as material scenarios through which Ismailis today are reconstructing their past and imagining their futures. What I want to concentrate on here is how these images challenge some of the topo in scholarship which I have mentioned. As noted, the scholarship on the Ismailis in Africa adopts the view that once in Africa, Ismailis had little connection with India. In my 2007 article on the socio-legal formation of the Nizari Ismailis in Africa, I noted that between the 19th and 20th century, community members in Africa were fully engaged with events in India, and that the emergent Nizari Khoja Ismaili community was constitutionally and institutionally created on both shores of the Western Indian Ocean, an idea wonderfully elaborated upon in 2014 by Dr. Suman Mukherjee. I want to add additional texture to this idea using the wedding photograph of Count Karmali Hirji, Countess Genevieve Hirji, and Abdul Malik Hirji, the third child of the Count's deceased first wife, Shirin Alarakia Barmal. A copy of the photograph was provided to me by Pareen Has Hirji, who currently resides in Germany. Based on oral history collected by family members, Count Hirji was born in 1896 at Madhapur in Gujarat's Kutch district. He migrated to East Africa in 1909 and secured employment in Aladina Vistram stores. He went on to establish a business in Bombo, some 20 miles north of Kampala in Uganda. In 1915, at the age of 19, he returned to Madhapur to marry Shirin Alarakia Barmal. The couple returned to East Africa and had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. After giving birth to her son in 1923, Shirin died. 5 years later, in 1928, Count Hirji again returned with his son to Bombay. Here he married Jenabai Ahmad Velji. The family returned to Bombo and eventually moved to Kampala. Subsequently, they had 9 children, including my father, Amir Karmali Hirji. The stamp on the bottom of the original matte frame tells us that the photograph was taken at the Excelsior studio in Bombay, one of the many photographic studios on Bombay's Kalba Devi Road. The district was also home to many Bohra, Parsi, Memar, and Khoja families from Gujarat. The photograph's materiality and marginalia confirm family tradition that Count Hirji returned to India to marry. It also indicates that some Ismailis in East Africa remained connected to India during the first decades of the 20th century to find brides, among other reasons. There is much to say about this photograph in terms of how the sitters are presented and comparisons with other photographs in India and Africa. For comparison, I'm showing a photo of a Bohra family taken a few decades earlier at Bombay's Torrens studio. I would like to focus briefly on issues of circulation and relationality. It is remarkable to think that this 90-year-old photograph was carried from India to Uganda in the late 1920s, and then prior to the 1972 expulsion of Ugandan Asians, it was carried to Austria and then Germany. It has since been circulating amongst 4 generations of the now globally dispersed Hirji family and forms part of their online family lineage page. Thus, the photo not only serves as historical evidence, but is an affective object whose preservation, copying, and circulation between family members affords them to connect with each other and mediate their collective and individual relationships to their ancestral paths across time and space. Photographic evidence showing ongoing connections between India and East Africa are also found in Ismaili-owned magazines published in Bombay, such as the Bombay Ismaili and the Khoja Sindhi Press, established by Lalji Bhai Devraj in 1903. Here are some examples taken from the Bombay Ismaili. These and other magazine images suggest the extent to which Ismailis in India were made aware of and interested in the affairs of their African co-religionists. There is much more to say about each of these photographs and many other photographs in community magazines, but in the interest of time, I want to focus on the 1932 portrait of Mukyani Jibai Giga, who built a Jamaat Khana at Pemba Vete at the cost of 30,000. Following up on Jibai's photograph, I came across an article by Mr. Kamruddin Rashid on his hometown of Pemba Wete, published on baraka.com. Mr. Rashid, now in Toronto, provided me with more details on Jibai, whose contribution begins to tease apart the highly gendered narratives that focus squarely on pioneering Ismaili men and their contributions to the Ismaili community. In our conversations, Mr. Rashid also provided me with a copy of a family photograph. It is not clear where this photograph was taken. It could have been in a Zanzibar studio. It is reminiscent of family portraits of other Gujarati families taken in Bombay in the early decades of the 20th century, like this image of an unidentified Bohra family. So in this sense, we can think of the transoceanic traffic in which photography was a medium of cultural transmission. What these and other photographs in Ismaili family collections often show is the prominence of the matriarch. In this, they index a gender visibility that scholarship has hitherto obscured. What is also interesting is that apart from articles of clothing and their manner of wearing that may signal communal identity, such images do not have any complex religious symbols. In contrast, I want to show you these 2 undated images taken outside Pembe Wito's Jamaat Khana that show a group of women seated around a photograph of Aga Khan III. They are similar to a photograph reprinted in Life magazine taken in Nairobi in 1937 with the Imam present. Arguably, these images depict a type of religiosity signaled through the posture adopted by its sitters and the centrality of the Imam in pictorial form or in person. In my reading, these images not only represent religious subjects, but they're indicative of how photographs created religious subjectivities through their circulation, adoption, and replication of particular norms and conventions of what I'm calling photographic presence. My thinking here recalls Chris Pinney's remark that taking pictures is still a choice involving aesthetics and ethical values. In conclusion, drawing inspiration from the work of Marina Rostow on the social palimpsest of Fatimid Chancery documents and Ollie Ackerman's work on social life of Alawi Bora manuscripts, my research is an invitation to think about the affordances of counter narratives and repertoires like photographs and photographic presences. so that we can open up old and new questions about Ismaili histories, thoughts, and practices, and see the people behind them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the fascinating presentation. We move on to Dr. Daryoush Mohammad here at the IIS, who's speaking on theology and metaphysics in contemporary Ismaili thought.
Good morning, everyone. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to I'm going to read very briefly the gist of what I'm going to talk about. So, brace yourself. It's going to be a little bit shocking, but yes, philosophical arguments tend to be like this every now and then. So, the title has got to do. There are different titles to it. Oh, where did it go? The key idea is that there are two topics at the heart of this: theology and metaphysics. What does it do in contemporary times? Where is it in contemporary Ismaili thought? So the gist of my argument is very simple and twofold. The first one is that I argue that classical and medieval theology and metaphysics is almost dead. This is a shocking part. One would rarely find credible theological and metaphysical arguments which rely on medieval language, terminology, and methods. Therefore, in response to the problems of the contemporary world, classical theology has become almost obsolete. What I mean by obsolete is not that these topics are not studied in academic settings. History of science very well continues to teach about pre-modern science, but that does not mean that pre-modern notions continue to be relevant or dominant or capable of solving problems of modern science. There is a difference between the archaeological importance of the past and what part of the past can continue to be applicable in modern times. So the second point, the depiction of matters of faith, and for that matter theology and metaphysics, as subjects which are purely otherworldly, oriented primarily towards the hereafter, or relating to divine qualities, can arguably be located in medieval theology. It's not difficult to find that out. Metaphysics itself is not dead. History and philosophy of modern science, again, is a testament to the fact that unexplored areas of knowledge border on metaphysical discussions. We have this in pure sciences, in mathematics and in physics, so it is no surprise to those of you who've got a background in sciences like myself. But bringing together discussions of metaphysics and making them part of a this-worldly affair is a novel move. And here lies my key argument about the Ismaili Imamate. So, I've got a couple of points that I've put over there about the underlying principles of it. I'm not going to read this one, but the key thing is that one of the fundamental principles is the compatibility of faith and intellect, is that there's no conflict between them. And we move forward from there. So the last point is that divine guidance, whether you talk about the authority of the prophets or the imams, is not there to limit or to counter the ability of human intellects. It's more than anything else an assistance to it and enrichment to it. So let me move forward with this one. So contemporary developments in the Ismaili community, as they are evident in the proliferation of institutionalization of the imamate and the community, have led many to argue that theology or metaphysics have now been driven to the shadows. Part of this claim stems from the fact that the current sophisticated network of Ismaili institutions has necessarily led to the development of a bureaucracy and the prominence of a generation of elite managers and administrators. This new formation can arguably be described drawing upon the Weberian ideal type of legal, rational, bureaucratic leadership, which is visibly distinct from a traditional or a charismatic style of leadership. The constellation of the Ismaili Imamate's institutions and the galaxy of vocabularies frequently used by the present Imam evidently indicate that they are not driven or inspired by theology, or at least not by one we are familiar with. Indeed, for the current institutions to operate, the present Imam does not need to reach out to classical theology or metaphysics to explain the existence and operation of his institutions. His own role as the Ismaili Imam, beside the way he articulates the ideas driving these institutions, seem sufficient to make them work. Perhaps one might even argue that adding a theological element to the rationale of these institutions may well be their death sentence. I'll explore this a little bit further. What I will be arguing now is twofold. Contemporary Ismailism, like that of any period in the past and possibly the future, relies organically on the present living Imam of the time, and as such, any doctrinal system emanates from the specific type of guidance that each of these Imams offers for his followers. And two, theological and metaphysical systems, if at all meaningful in this context, would inevitably be developed around what makes the Ismaili community what it is: allegiance to the Imam of the time. As such, the very content of this theology/metaphysics cannot be anything other than the guidance of this Imam. So far, there is nothing new or unprecedented about Ismailis in medieval times too, because they use the same logic. This is articulated in Tusi's Paradise of Submission as follows. This is the citation which I often use. So this is in part of in a chapter from Rawzat Taslim, in which he talks about the refinement of character, and his key argument is that whatever in the world, whether it's about ethical pronouncements or it's got about the interactions between people, akhlaq and muamalat, it entirely relies on the guidance of the Imam of the time in every era. So basically, the idea is that the Imam has carte blanche to change it any way he desires. So it goes back to the unfettered authority of the Imam of the time. I'm going to keep this on the screen. You've got that created image of Tusi there. So the key point is that this truthful master, this Imam of the time, is the one around whom all these ideas of ethical contents of the faith, and also the way he articulates the matters of faith and even his own position, it relies on him. He would define what his job description is. It's not something set in the past. The only methodological element I would add is that the content of the Imam's guidance in each era is seen in the mirror of encountering the people around him and the time in which he lives. In other words, it is a response to the problems of his time, but with a key component of the authoritative role of the Imam. I've argued before in my PhD work that a paradigm shift has taken place in terms of how the Imam guides his community. In simpler terms, I describe this as a change of coordinates for locating authority and how it is deployed and used to elicit obedience. I have demonstrated in my book that the former theological and sometimes polemical language has now been replaced with a language which is oriented towards improving the quality of life of Ismailis and the people amongst whom they live. Everybody knows this. This is the language of the Imamate today. It's written all over it. The former used to rely extensively on a set of postulates or axioms which formed medieval or classical theology and metaphysics. Right here, I would like to point out that the use of the term theology or metaphysics for Ismaili thought and philosophy is at best due to the lack of a better terminology. Terms such as thought, philosophy, or doctrines can better capture these threads, even though there are clearly themes or subjects that overlap with classical theology. However, the latter, the language and requirements of development, do not quite resonate with classical theological arguments or metaphysical foundations. And here is the critical juncture of the debate. European language or notion of development is rooted in the discourse of modernity. To some, it may appear that the case of the Ismaili Imamate resembles modernity. It is, however, inaccurate to explain the efforts of the Ismaili Imamate using the reason of enlightenment or the logic of European singular modernity or Eurocentric modernity, if you like. It can only be explained under the rubric of multiple modernities rather than the linear, unique Eurocentric one. To articulate his points or to guide his community, the Imam does not ever use terms such as Zat, Sifat, Jabr, Ikhtiyar, Aql Kul, Nafs Kul, Mafruq, or Musta'naf, just to mention a few terms from different disciplines. Instead, a set of terms punctuate his guidance which are visibly born today, but once they are uttered in the voice of the present Imam, they also gain the weight of tradition and possibly charisma, as well to sustain their longevity. These terms, which may very well sound European or modern, have the critical signature and the critical and visible signature of the Aga Khan with his nuanced narrative of each of these. Does all this mean that there has been a complete break and clean break from the past and one can find no remnants of the past in this new development? My response is an emphatic no. one can certainly find many elements from the past in it, and this is nothing exclusive to Ismailis. Ismaili thought is no tabula rasa. Now, this is a point that Karl Popper alludes to in his Myth of the Framework, my favorite guy. That's his caricature of Popper. But the key idea of Popper is that the growth of knowledge is primarily relying on an incremental growth, which goes back to the knowledge of the past. It is a modification. It is a revision of the knowledge of the past. That is the point that I've highlighted down there. That there is simply no new knowledge without some kind of earlier knowledge, some kind of expectation upon which it is a modification. And such modifications occur especially when earlier knowledge runs into trouble, for example, when an expectation is disappointed, when it gives rise to a problem. This is precisely the problem-oriented narrative of the critical rationalist philosophy of science. Of course, I know that positivists completely disagree with this. So, in the case of Ismailis, belief in the unfettered authority of the Imam of the time never means, from an epistemological, not a doctrinal or dogmatic point of view, that all the time they are beginning with a clean slate, disregarding the past. Even if they wanted to have an empty bucket, they wouldn't be able to have it. But the claim that they should be constantly invoking a paradigm from the past, which may very well have become obsolete today, to have an element of theology or metaphysics is yet another error. So I move on to the point that I mentioned at the beginning about the demise of classical theology. In a recent article in the Oxford Handbook of Quranic Studies, Walid Saleh has discussed the emergence of scriptural theology. He has made this significant and bold claim, which I said it earlier, but these are basically his own words. The demise of Kalam in the wake of modernity in the Islamic world was an unceremonious affair. Indeed, no one has noticed its whimpering end. Well, you may disagree with him, but it's very important to pay attention to it. He further on proposes that the reconfiguration of Islamic theology and its total destabilization due to the atrophy of its older tools has meant that the new theological methods and modes of discourse have escaped our attention. Modern Islamic theology is a discipline still looking for a name and a study. What I argue here is that the language of the Ismaili Imamate in contemporary times is one of these modes of discourse, which has escaped the attention of scholars and non-scholars alike. What we find today in the guidance of the present Ismaili Imam is indeed one of the examples of what a modern Islamic theology might look like. In his chapter, Saleh argues that contemporary Muslims have gone directly to the scripture and exercised their own agency to interpret and explicate the scripture in response to what they need. He names the figures who happen to be among revivalists and reformists in the Muslim world. Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi, Sayyid Ghut, Muhammad Abdu, among others. These figures are known to us not just through what they wrote, but primarily through what they did politically. Their deeds spoke much louder than their words. They left their own legacy for the world in which we live, and the list of these names are long. Right here, I would like to add other names who, whether they produced something in the form of a scholarly work or not, had similar influences, and each left their own legacy. Among them is Muhammad Iqbal, Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and of course Agha Khan III. They were and continue to be categorized as reformers. Whether the label is accurate or not is another matter. What matters is that they left a legacy, and their legacy represents a shift or a change of coordinates, or a change in discourse. It is in this sense, and by identifying what they emphasized more and what they shifted their attention away from, that we realize the birth of a new system of thinking. You can call that a theology or a metaphysical system. You could use any term you like. Names and labels don't change the realities or the outcomes of a system of thought. This is where a distinction must be made between essentialist and nominalist methodologies. Essentialist methodologies suggest that you can use names and uncover the hidden truth or the true realities behind them. It's a very clear Platonic idea. On the other hand, nominalist methodologies aim to describe how a thing behaves in various circumstances, rather than trying to penetrate the crux of that thing to arrive at the core or essence of it. whereas essentialist methodologies argue that the task of pure knowledge is the discovery of the hidden nature or essence of things. Nominalist ones consider the aim of science to be the description of the things and events of our experience and an explanation of these events. That is, their description with the help of universal laws. They see in our language, and especially in those of its rules, which distinguishes properly constructed sentences and inferences from a mere heap of words, the great instrument of scientific description. Words are thus considered a subsidiary tool for this task and not as names of essences. This is what Popper actually extends in a long chapter in his Open Society and Its Enemies, where he discusses the Platonic and Aristotelian ideas of essentialism. So for those of you who want to read it further, you could go back to that one. So one of my key claims is that in contemporary times, the behavior of the Ismaili Imamate suggests moving closer to nominalism and further away from the essentialist methodologies which were the hallmark of the legacy of Aristotle and Plato. And this is a significant move. But we had it in the past, it's just making bigger, yeah. So going back to the case of Ismailis, Khan III kick-started the engine of social reforms in the Ismaili community. He laid the foundations of what later became an integral part of the Khan development network today. Attention to areas such as education, healthcare, economy, and later culture, contrary to what might be described by some, was not purely an outcome of an encounter with Europe, reducing these efforts to derogatory labels such as westernization or being accomplices to the British colonialists without seeing the backgrounds and contexts served nothing other than inflating the balloon of conspiracy theories. The building blocks of this new orientation are education, healthcare, economic and cultural development. Behind all of these, at least in the case of the Ismaili Imamate, is a set of values which resonate with various phases in the history of the community and represent the vitality of the dynamism of its leadership. All these together form and shape the contemporary Ismaili doctrines. If the Ismaili Imam does not spend his time on expounding proofs about the existence of God, it does not mean that there is either no theology or that metaphysics has become irrelevant. Indeed, if you want to highlight examples of such as these, Ismailis never treated theology in the same way that other Muslim communities did. I mean, but specifically, I'm going back to somebody like Al-Ghazali when he was writing his Al-Munqidh, because he was also against it at the end of his life. A case in point is the writings of the Ismaili Da'is about knowledge of God and their negative theology, from Al-Sajistani to Al-Shahristani, Hasan al-Sabbah, Al-Tusi, and even an Imam like Khan III. Nonetheless, there are still so many passages from the writings of authors like Hamid al-Din al-Kirmani, Qazi al-Nu'man, Al-Mu'ayyad fi-Din al-Shirazi, Nasir al-Khusraw, which are so relevant today, but are by no means filled with the medieval terminology of classic theology or jargons of early Ismaili Neoplatonism. These passages are ironically ones that the present Imam can easily incorporate into his speeches without appearing like a classical philosopher from 10 centuries ago. What I've suggested above is nothing other than the evolutionary nature of critical rationalism. Our theories, or rather our nets for capturing the truth, require constant modifications and revisions. Whenever our theories do not live up to our expectations, we revise them. Those that continue to withstand our critical assessments will continue to operate, but those which fail the test will either be modified through eliminating their errors or will be totally discarded. And this is nothing but a key method for the growth of knowledge. This is what the present Imam has pointed in his speech at the Sirat conference of 1976. This is one of my favorite quotes. So I've got it with the voice of His Highness here.
The Holy Prophet's life gives us every fundamental guideline that we require to resolve the problem as successfully as our human minds and intellect can visualize. His example of integrity, loyalty, honesty, generosity, both of means and of time, his solicitude for the poor, the weak, and the sick, his steadfastness in friendship, his humility in success, his magnanimity in victory, his simplicity, His wisdom in conceiving new solutions for problems which could not be solved by traditional methods without affecting the fundamental concepts of Islam. Surely, all these are foundations which, directly understood and sincerely interpreted, must enable us to conceive what should be a truly modern and dynamic Islamic society.
So the majority of people focus on the first part. The believer looks at all the descriptions of the Prophet. The philosopher looks at the part that I've highlighted. It's about finding solutions to problems that could not be sorted out with traditional methods. So this is the underpinning of contemporary Ismaili thought. Look for new solutions when traditional ones fail. Any contemporary theology, I would prefer to say system of belief, should be able to accommodate educational excellence, a good quality of healthcare, a healthy economy, a thriving cultural atmosphere, a vibrant and environmentally conscious engagement with the world, and a critical, sincere intellectual interaction. Otherwise, it will be a recipe for dooming mankind to failure. Taking life on earth seriously and avoiding sharp dichotomies between faith and the world and faith and intellect, which have now become cornerstones of Ismaili thought, are some of the significant building blocks of a modern Islamic system of belief. Incidentally, all of these are abundantly found in the words of the present Ismaili Imam, whether in his farmans to his community or in his speeches and in his institutional action. He does not just talk about his system of belief. He acts upon it and he builds upon it. His lifetime legacy is a testimony to the consistent development of a signature system of beliefs, the system developed by the present Ismaili Imam, which is at the same time rooted in history and tradition. The claim that Ismailism does not have any theology or metaphysics in contemporary times is patently false, I believe, with all humility. The Ismaili system of thought, as I would prefer to call it, is both institutional and derived from the Imam's vision, beside engagement with the real problems in the world. It is problem-oriented. It is subject to change, like any theory is bound to change, and in that change, the Imam will certainly play a central role. So here you have a synthetic model, critical rationalism, coupled with a Shi'i doctrine of Imamat. Admittedly, this is not an easy combination. To some, it even seems paradoxical. How can authority work hand in hand with critical rationalism? The example of it can be seen in the case of the Ismaili Imamat. But where do you find it? In all aspects of the leadership and guidance of the present Imam, his speeches, his farmans, the example of his life, and even the architecture of this very same building, and many more like it. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryoush. We move on to Professor Karim H. Karim, from Carlton University in Canada, who will be speaking on contemporary Nizari thoughts, pragmatic turn, and the centrality of ethics.
Good morning. Not sure if it's still morning. And
It is just about.
my watch is still stuck on Vancouver time. That's electronics for you. It's 3:41 there, a.m. And assalamu alaikum and ya ali madad. I'd like to thank the organizers and the IAS, and particularly Daryoush for all the work that he's put in, for inviting me to the conference. I'd also like to congratulate Zain Qasim on her appointment as director. Zain and I went to school. You did go to Aga Khan High School in Nairobi, right? Okay, so she was 2 years ahead of me, and still is. Just joking. And we were at McGill together, so congratulations, Zain. It's an inspired choice for director. I'd also like to salute Dr. Farhad Daftari, my colleague, my fellow co-director for a couple of years, in which I thoroughly enjoyed working with him. And he has thoroughly deserved what he says is a rest from meetings. Okay, coming to my paper. Okay. This seems to be Zulkoja's. Sorry, I think you might have uploaded the wrong
This is
paper
not
from
the
my
right.
file. In any case, I'll just proceed while the paper is being loaded. It's the one in the file of 2022, not 1922. So 2022. No, good. Yes, that's the one, I guess. No, that might not be the current version. But just go down to 2022 and the PowerPoint. Okay, good. That's the one. So let's move along. The Fatimid Dai Ahmad al-Naisaburi warned that chaos would reign in the Imam's realm when, quote, security, decency, piety, life, honor, and chivalry cease. His Ar-Risala al-Mujaza al-Qafiya fil Adab al-Duat expresses deep concern about corruption in the Fatimid state in the time of Al-Hakim. Naisaburi held that influential members of the Dawah had become preoccupied with their own power and privilege rather than knowledge of faith, ilm, piety, taqwa, and proper administration, siyasa. And I'm drawing on Verena Clem and Paul Walker's edited and translated book of Naisaburi's Risala for this. Wahid Amin, in a review of the book, notes that Naisaburi is concerned with questions of ideal governance, and he presents an ethics suited for a particular administrative class of individuals. The Risala systematically addresses particular virtues that the administrative da'is have to attain and the vices that they have to eliminate from their person and work. Sumaya Hamdani, there she is. It is published. I double-checked, Sumaya. You produce so much work that you forget, but it's a conversation we had yesterday about this. Sumaya suggests that this treatise should be read not only as a text produced by the particular circumstances of Al-Hakim's reign, but also of the larger phenomenon of the Dawah's emergence as a distinct professional group. She notes that the Risala continued in latter periods to be a key text in the Tayyibi Dawah and was submitted as evidence in two court cases of the early 20th century on the issue of the parameters of the Dawah's leadership in India. Whereas Nizari Ismailis dropped the Dawah structure in their leadership and governance systems, they have continued to have a hierarchical organization framed within a belief system that places the Imam as providing leadership for worldly and spiritual matters. Even though the current Nizari Imam Aga Khan IV is not the ruler of territory, he is at the head of transnational structures of communal and non-communal organizations. These institutions require administrative management and technical expertise in a variety of areas. It would seem that the 11th century treatise, which addresses the professionalization of the Imama's governance structures, has some pertinence for administrative management in the current Nizari Imam's institutions. Now, I'll be going back and forth between the Risala and contemporary times. For Naysaburi, moral and ethical comportment is much more important than technical expertise. Ilm, taqwa, siyasa are the necessary personal characteristics for managing the Imam's community. Social scientific scholars of contemporary organizational systems have noted that they are underwritten by a positivist philosophical framework that prioritizes rationalism, technique, and efficiency. Technocracy is a form of governance in which those with expertise in management and areas of instrumental knowledge hold the reins of decision making. Political science critique against technocracy is that it depends on, quote, flawed theory of knowledge and forms, quote, unjust concentrations of power. Such scholarly commentary, of course, does not, or to date has not, addressed this form of administrative governance in religious contexts. However, in broaching the ethical issues related to epistemology and power, it is akin to Naysaburi's concerns about highly placed dais becoming preoccupied with corrupt pursuit of power and privilege rather than operating within a framework of religious knowledge. The professionalized Fatimid administration valued technical aspects of management, but according to Naysaburi, was straying from the primary ethos of the Dawat al-Hadiya, the rightly guided mission, and the Dawat al-Haq, the mission of truth, the two proper names of the institution. Naysaburi is not an outlier in addressing ethics among Ismaili authors. In the last 10 centuries, a number of works emerging from the movement have engaged in various ways with the topic. The authors include Al-Nu'man, Nasir Khosro, Nasiruddin Tusi, Sadruddin Mustansibullah II, and more recently, the Institute of Ismaili Studies, the Aga Khan Foundation, and the Global Center for Pluralism. The current Nizari Imam has placed ethics at the center of his engagement with the public sphere, transnationally. And to quote from Daryoush, perhaps from an earlier iteration, he seems to have slightly changed his position, that as the Nizari Imam takes his institutions, quote, through the tensions of past, present, and future, the metaphysics or the theology to support this shift does not seem to exist except in a very minimal form, unlike earlier periods. In order to explain the dual nature of his office to public audiences, the Aga Khan has often referred to the dyadic Islamic concepts of deen wa dunya, which have been variously translated as faith and world, religion and society, spirit and matter. The denotation of deen is not Islam only, but faith, religiosity, and spirituality of all peoples. Ethics serve to bridge deen and dunya as well as religious and secular worldviews. The Aga Khan has publicly advocated for what he calls ethical literacy. His discourse frequently addresses virtues and ethics in secular contexts in speaking to general audiences. Adrian Clarkson, a former Governor General of Canada, observed in the introduction to a book of his speeches that he has sought to promote the development of, quote, a universal ethical sensibility. The following passage from the Aga Khan's speech at the University of Alberta deals with some quotidian contexts of ethical lapses. The problem extends into every area of human enterprise. When a construction company cheats on the quality of materials for a school or a bridge, when a teacher skimps on classwork in order to sell his time privately, when a doctor recommends a drug because of incentives from a pharmaceutical company, when a bank loan is skewed by kickbacks or a student paper is plagiarized from the internet, When the norms of fairness and decency are violated in any way, then the foundations of society are undermined. One can almost hear in this an echo of Nisaburi's 1,000-year-old warning, chaos will reign when decency disappears. The IIS's document, Aga Khan Development Network and Ethical Framework, dated 2000, states at the outset that the AKDN is, quote, a contemporary endeavor of the Ismaili Imamate to realize the social conscience of Islam through institutional action. This text does present some metaphysical underpinnings in its narrative, but it lacks the kind of rigorous theological narrative that one sees in some of the earlier works. And I certainly take Daryoush's point in terms of the way that this may appear in its own context. The network comprises a range of institutions that operate with the goal of improving the quality of life. In stating that it is an endeavor to realize the social conscience of Islam through institutional action, the ethical framework text suggests that Islamic ideas are manifested in the ways in which AKDN's institutions are conceptualized, organized, and operationalized. The network describes itself as non-denominational. This is meant to indicate that it operates beyond the communities of the Aga Khan's religious followers, who are served communally by a distinct set of transnational organizations of their own. AKDN's non-denominational character is underwritten by what the Nizari Imam calls a cosmopolitan ethic that seeks to approach diverse peoples whom it engages universally through a pluralistic approach. When a group engages in philosophic discourses about ideas of global concern with others, it enters into the tussle of vigorous public debate. It also opens itself up to greater public scrutiny. There is a likelihood that its organizational structure and leadership will come under sharper study by scholars, media, governments, and ideological rivals. An institution that declares itself to be a transnational interlocutor on universal ethics will be challenged sooner or later. The modes of operation of its agencies and personnel stand a high chance of being inspected, among other things, for ethical practice. Societal organizations that have clearly stated ethical goals are not immune to serious problems like conflicts of interest, fraud, cronyism, nepotism, bullying, harassment, and gender-related exploitation. Several prominent institutions have been revealed to have transgressed their own moral principles. For example, the Catholic Church's concealment of some clergy's involvement in fiscal and sexual abuses has become widely known through the global media. And Oxfam, a secular international NGO that is dedicated to fighting poverty and injustice, came under the spotlight, quote, over allegations that its aid workers prostituted disaster victims and that its leaders tried to cover up the scandal. One would expect that groups that have declared themselves to be championing ethics would go to great lengths to ensure that their own institutions and personnel, as well as its religious adherents, become knowledgeable and disciplined with respect to ethical conduct. Contemporary ethicists, Adriana Kezar and Daniel Maxey, note that without using intentionally ethical processes, leaders within organizations are prone to ethical lapses. Intentional ethical processes can be manifested in codes for particular organizations or groups. Such codes are usually framed within the specific philosophical or theological frameworks favored by respective groups. Revisiting Nisaburi's text, we see that he identifies knowledge of faith, God-conscious piety, and conscientious administrative management as three key elements in his approach. Ilm here prioritizes religious over technical or professional knowledge of administration. It emphasizes the primacy of the conscientious operation of the state over one which merely favors efficiency. Siyasa has to be governed by ilm, whereas current use of the term siyasa usually refers to politics in general. Pre-modern Muslim literature, and we heard about this in a discussion about the Rasail yesterday, pre-modern Muslim literature applied it in the context of the religious purposes of political authority and statecraft. Naysaburi's uses of the word in the specific, Naysaburi uses the word in specific Shia Ismaili context in which the Dawah administers the state with the overall guidance of the Imam. Siyasa incorporates professional administrative experience, but it is necessarily linked to ilm and taqwa. The latter is related to the verb waqa, which denotes to preserve, to protect, to safeguard, or to shield. The word taqwa relates to guarding against wrong action, of being careful, knowing your place in the cosmos. It is inspired by the humble believer's experience of awe in front of God. One has to take measures to safeguard oneself against lapses. In the first half of the 20th century, procedural guidelines for the governance of Indian Nizaris, that is Satpanthi Khojas, appeared in several editions of rules and regulation booklets. Advice on appropriate behavior was printed in religious education texts, and materials produced currently by the IAS for the transnational Nizari community also address ethical issues. Ethics are also part of the secularly oriented Aga Khan Academy's curriculum. However, most of the recent materials produced, including the AKDN's ethical framework, are theoretical in nature and do not provide practical guidelines. There are a couple of exceptions to which I would like to refer. The Global Center for Pluralism's Code of Ethics and Conduct addresses truthfulness, corruption, transparency, accountability, and respect for diversity. The Aga Khan Foundation's code includes protection from sexual abuse or exploitation, as well as inappropriate behavior such as bullying and harassment. There is little overlap of issues in either document that were produced separately. And neither makes mention of the AKDN's ethical framework. The network's institutions operate in the public sphere nationally and transnationally. How then has the Nizari public engagement on ethics been received externally? As it turns out, the record on how certain civil society and government bodies have assessed Nizari institutions has not been glowing. Charity Intelligence Canada, an organization that monitors charities in the country, gave Aga Khan Foundation Canada a grade of B-, largely due to the lack of financial transparency. Focus Humanitarian Assistance, an affiliate of AKDN, is an international crisis response and disaster risk management agency. It received a D from the monitoring body, according to which, quote, it is not financially transparent, has low results reporting grade, and has low demonstrated impact. Whereas contemporary Nizaris have been seriously engaged in contributing to public discourses on ethics, the turbulent seas of national politics, as well as certain bodies' modes of assessing ethical adherence, have made for some rough sailing. Let us turn to communal Nizari organizations. We have here a particular set of transnational circumstances. The self-image of a group that has prioritized ethics is also coexistent with an uneven terrain which is characterized by the following: heteronormative male hegemony, vast differences in wealth, the Khoja ethnic group's dominance, and the prominence of a small group of families. Also relevant to this analysis are the seemingly paradoxical factors of offering service in a religious context and the increasing primacy given to technocratically driven efficiency, which is amoralistic. Nizari media and leaders often refer to ethical adherence as being central to communal values. The group's institutions are described as ethics in action. This encourages the belief that the organizations are ethically perfect, not only in conception, but also in operation, even though all human institutions in practice are prone to moral slippage. The drive to get the job done often tempts administrators to prioritize expediency over conscientiousness. Attention to ethical lapses is dimmed when the ends are seen as justifying the means. The objective of Naysaburi's strong emphasis on taqwa, God-conscious piety, appears to have been to safeguard against such hubris. One needs constantly to be humble about one's tendency to lapse. Notwithstanding the serious efforts to diversify the leadership of organizations, South Asians, particularly those resident in Western countries, continue disproportionately to hold positions in international Nizari bodies. Among them, certain families have tended to occupy leadership posts generationally. The nouveau riche, particularly those with a technocratic bent, also rise to the top. If a strong case can be made for this situation, it nevertheless raises questions about adhering to the values of pluralism and meritocracy, which have become the buzzwords in contemporary Nizari discourses. Service to the institutions of the Imam is generally viewed by its adherents as religious duty. Volunteerism is considered to be an important communal value. This produces a generous supply of people offering their services, which then tends to raise the tendency to take volunteers for granted and the potential for mistreatment. The resulting sense of broken trust leads to deeply felt betrayal experienced in one's own community, a community of ethics. In conclusion, the contemporary Nizari discourse has placed ethics at the center of its concerns, and it has also utilized it pragmatically as a dialogic bridge with which to engage various publics. However, the pragmatics of this discourse appear largely to have refrained from addressing some of the pertinent practicalities of life. It has also not sufficiently taken into account the amoral technocratic drive for efficiency, the pressures on institutions to get the job done, and the transnational Nizari community's social structures, all of which present substantial challenges for the implementation of ethical ideals. In stating that the AKDN is an endeavor to realize the social conscience of Islam through institutional action, Nizaris have set a high bar. Whether this superior standard for ethical performance has been achieved is a matter for judgment. It is clear, nevertheless, that much more needs to be done to understand the full scope of the imagined ideal and its attainment. The next stage of Nizari intellectual engagement with the subject of ethics will need to ensure aspirational theory takes social and institutional realities into account in order to keep chaos at bay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karim. We move to Dr. Delia Cortese from Middlesex University, who will be speaking on the Fatimids in fiction.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers of this conference and to the technical staff and to the volunteers who have looked after us so nicely. I think after 3 days of intense deliberation, we can do with a bit of rahat al-aql, a bit of rest for the intellect, not in a Kirmani sort of way, but in my own way. And I brought my little friend to keep us company during this talk. Okay, so sit back, relax, and hopefully enjoy, dear friends in the room and colleagues in the room and those online. Can you hear me properly? Okay, let's go. The perceived mystery surrounding the endorsement of esotericism, the opulent display of luxury and immense wealth. What do I do with this?
The one with the first one. Yeah.
Okay. The lives of a number of charismatic male and female figures, the defiance shown by a religious political minority in pursuit of world domination, all contributed in making the age of the Fatimids fertile ground from which to harvest material for fiction. From literature to popular lore and films to videos and digital games, animations and cartoons, the Fatimids have been making regular appearances in plots either as a central character or as extras. The construction of fictionalized accounts on or around the Fatimids has a history that goes back to the time when the dynasty originated and the era of its dominance that followed. For polemic reasons and with a view to discredit the Shia Ismaili brand of Islam that the Fatimids embodied and endorsed, medieval Sunni authors took to extend to them, for example, atrocities and libertine practices that were first invented about the Carmatians. These and more questionable accusations shaped the subsequent anti-Ismaili opinions, with the result that the perception of them being heretics gained strength. This deliberate fabrication escalated into black legends that, read acritically and out of context, came to be taken as true accounts. But what about fictional representations for fiction's sake? In this paper, through the survey of a range of examples drawn from a variety of media, I will consider the nuanced way in which the Fatimids have been featuring in modern and contemporary fiction, mostly Western or targeted to Western audiences, but not only. My argument is that beyond entertainment value, modern and contemporary fictional portrayals can be seen as consequential in reshaping current perception of Islam and its history. Here I consider the role the Fatimids could play in this process. In view of this, I will examine the context that have brought the Fatimids to gain a niche status in the world of fiction, while sharing some considerations regarding the opportunities and challenges that the analysis of this material can offer in expanding the breadth of applications and scope of Fatimid and Ismaili studies. The Fatimids first entered modern Western fiction by default within the genre of poems, popular stories, and novels, which had the Crusaders as a central theme. Christian-centered literary canon devoted to the stories of the ventures in the Holy Land had already developed in Europe from the Middle Ages onwards. In these works, the generic Muslim, Saracen, or Turk is the enemy, and the Fatimids, though the historically real counterparts, at least as far as the First and Second Crusades are concerned, are rarely openly named as such. In modern Western fiction, one of the earliest representatives of the Crusader theme as literary genre is Robert Howard. His novels Gates of Empire and Other Tales of the Crusaders, published in 1932, being a compilation of 8 classic adventures. The power struggle between Shawar, one of the last Fatimid viziers, and the nominally Fatimid, the general Shirkuh, uncle of Salah ad-Din, and the Crusader Al-Malik I of Jerusalem set the tone of the last story in the book, Gate of Empire. In more recent times, a classic of the genre has been Assassin's Creed, the pulp novel series published in the 2000, part of a franchise that includes films, comics, digital games. In the series, some plots conflate the Crusaders and the Templar stories with legends about the Ismailis of Iran and Syria against the backdrop of the late Fatimid pseudo-historical context. Elsewhere, in contrast to the typical bashing of the Muslims, the Fatimids make a bad guys turned good guys appearance in Ellis Peters' 1981 mystery novel, The Labor of St. Giles. Having captured in Egypt the hero Guimard de Messar, the Fatimids make their Crusader enemies believe that their champion is dead. Instead, the Fatimid doctor diagnosed Guimard with leprosy and treats him. So the novel was hugely successful and adapted to TV drama. Moving away from the Crusaders' framework, in 2007, the Fatimids took the center stage with a novel by the Austrian writer Johanna Awad Glaser, and the novel is Die Schattenkalifen, The Shadow She-Caliph, based on the life of the Fatimid princess Sitt al-Mulk. It is knowingly the only historical novel written for a Western audience, entirely dedicated to a female figurehead of the pre-modern Islamic history. From fantasy to historical novel, the Fatimids came to form the corollary of the 2010 Scott Oden The Lion of Cairo, an adventure and intrigue pulp novel set in the last days of the Fatimids. The Caliph is under siege. When almost all is lost, one man comes to the rescue, the Emir of the Knife. Here, the legends of the assassins of Alamut conflate with the story of the Fatimids' demise. Carrying the subplot forward are women such as royal princesses, modeled on the aunties of the last Fatimid caliphs, and ordinary women who, with their intrigues and ruses, evoke their counterparts in the Arabian Nights. It is indeed in some of the in some of the tales of the Arabian Nights that we must look for earlier fictional accounts in Arabic, where we can trace inspirations from the age of the Fatimids. Indeed, as argued by Robert Irving, the landscape informing several stories of the Arabian Nights is not Abbasid Baghdad, but in fact Al-Hakim's Cairo. In modern times, one of the most popular overtly Fatimid-centered novels to appear in Arabic was that of Hirji Zaidan, a book titled Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi and published in Cairo in 1913, and then it was translated in several ways. Sorry, I think sorry. I anticipated that. So, Hirji Zaidan, contrary to what one can assume from the title, the plot of this historical novel revolves around the highly fictionalized and anachronistically situated Princess Sitt al-Mulk, presented here as the sister of the last Fatimid Caliph. Here we follow the vicissitudes of the princess as she tries to disentangle herself from the web of intrigues masterminded by two rival men who compete to marry her for their respective agendas. Zaidan was a prolific and hugely popular writer of the Nahda Renaissance period of modern Arabic literature. Through fictionalized historical accounts, like this one centered around the last days of the Fatimids, Zaidan intended to provide his readers with an easy access to their own history. Zaidan's mission in popularizing the pre-modern Islamic past through his novels and literary magazine Al-Hilal that was founded in 1892, would have a profound impact in shaping the ideas of national consciousness and identity among modern Egyptians. Fast forward to 1989, and we find the Fatimids again taking center stage in Ben Salem Himmish historical award-winning novel, The Theocrat. First published in Arabic and then translated in many European languages. Rooted in the use of Arabic primary sources, the novel taps into the enduring fascination with the mystery surrounding the figure of Al-Hakim. Mixing fact with historical imagination, the author uses this formula to transform a recorded instance in the life of the Imam Caliph to launch into a fantastic reconstruction of events. On the whole, the plot revolves around the cliché of the Imam Caliph as the villain whose rule is driven by madness, only mildly mitigated by his contradictory character. Most of the book centers around the tension between Al-Hakim and his arch enemy, the rebel Abu Raqqa, who sought to overthrow him. By the end of the novel, the dark cloud over Al-Hakim lifts when one of his supporters from Syria, rather than madness, recognizes in him a divinity. Sit al-Mulk is there as Al-Hakim alter ego, and so on. By the way, Al-Hakim inspired a poem published in the New York in 1996, a poem by our former librarian Eric Ormsby. And Al-Hakim also inspired a poet of the Beat generation, Philip Lamantia, who made it his business to go and visit Al-Hakim Mosque in Cairo. Among other novels from the Arabic canon of contemporary literature, we have a fictional narrative by Ramzia Abbas al-Iriani, who wrote a novel called Sulta, published in 1997, and this is dedicated to Al-Sayyid al-Hurra, the other superwoman of the Fatimid period. So this is a contribution by this female writer, novelist. The Age of the Fatimids is a backdrop for many films on the Crusades. Typically embedded, the Crusades, especially typically embedded in the First Crusade of 1099. Exploiting all the possible negative stereotypes available, the plot in these movies are typically led from the Crusaders' point of view, with the Muslim counterparts pictured as the villains. Too many to count, movies of this genre found a special place in Italian cinema, with the drama and comedy films ranging from The Silent La Gerusalemme Liberata by Guazzoni in 1935, and then by Bragaglia later, and other productions down to the miniseries I Crociati in 2001. In this and other cases, the stories are lifted from a well-known Italian epic poem, La Gerusalemme Liberata, published by Torquato Tasso in 1581, and here with my compatriots in the room, who were students like me in high school, we suffered a lot as a result of having to study this Gerusalemme Liberata, and he is coming back to haunt us. It's boring. Okay, so, but in the Torquato Tasso's story centers around the First Crusade, and in a very highly fictionalized way, but there are references indirect to Al-Mustali as the king of Egypt, and there are references to Gaza and to his army, and how this army is so powerful that, in fact, in Canto 17, Torquato Tasso spends 200 verses this 200 verse in describing the army of this king from Egypt who goes to launch into sort of trying to stop the Crusaders' advance. Beside being turned into film scripts, the Liberata inspired other forms of art works, and here you can see all the ramification from opera, music, librettos. Verdi's first opera was based on the Liberata, and so an opera was made out of it. Another genre film genre that we can look at. There are other cinematic expressions. One is a film that was made in Egypt in 1947, Abu Ziad al-Hilali, and this is about the story of the Banu Hilal moving in their advance towards North Africa, and it's based on the oral epic called the Tagribat Bani Hilal, and it was even made into a series, Egyptian TV series in the 90s. So this is all based, the context is the reign of the Imam Caliph al-Mustansir, and this provides the background to these stories. The Arabs in general and the Fatimids in particular are integral part of Sicily cultural DNA and architectural landscape. In today's Sicily, many references to the Fatimids' past is hidden behind the construct of Arabo-Norman to describe the extent rich heritage resulting from the encounter in the island between the incumbent Muslim rulers and the Christian Normans. The expression Arabo-Norman underlies a pro-Norman bias at the expense of the Fatimids in particular and the Arabs in general as the dominant contributors to that culture. In Sicily, this heritage is celebrated in a broader range of popular cultural artifacts that span from richly decorated confectionery boxes featuring representations of scene, imagining the Arab handover of the city of Palermo to the Normans, to folk entertainment, plays centered on the Christian heroes defeating the Arab Muslim villains are still performed in public, with their stories being integral part of the canon of Sicilian puppet theater tradition, today recognized as UNESCO World Immaterial Heritage. Projects such as the production of films sponsored by the island regional administration included in 2017 the web series Indictus la terra e di nessuno, a fiction that pays homage to the Sicilian past by capturing one aspect of the struggle for supremacy between Arabs and Normans as competing forces. The drama unfolds within the context of the 1063 Battle of Cerami, an event that saw the Normans fighting and winning against an alliance of Fatimid vassals made of the Sicilian Kalbids and North African Zirid armies. In contrast to the typical, let's say, demonization of the Muslim that takes place in this type of production. Here it is interesting to see that actually the Muslims, in this case the Fatimids, were intervening from Egypt into this battle, are represented as very civilized, very educated, very noble, seeking peace, and showing a display of a kind of superiority in terms of their knowledge and the knowledge of science. So there is a very strong attempt to balance, and sort of try to bring a kind of balanced way in which the Arab, the Muslim are represented. So the enemies presented here as more civilized and more sort of advanced in such respect than the Norman. Than the Normans. The Battle of Cerami was the subject of a painting by the French painter Prosper Lafay, and this painting is now in Versailles. But the purpose of the painter was not so much to celebrate the winning of the Normans over the Arabs, but to celebrate the French victory. So this is why, in fact, the painting is in Versailles. Okay, in film produced as contemporary video installation art pieces, we find that the Fatimids are represented in the work of the Egyptian conceptual artist Wael Shawki. Shawki dedicated a film trilogy to the Crusades theme with videos called The Horror Show File, The Path to Cairo, and The Secrets of Kerbala. In various ways, the Fatimids feature in these three film installations, and in one in particular, the speaker, I mean, the actors in the film are not actors, but marionettes, puppets. And in one, the central character of this story, where the artist wants to represent the experience of the Crusade, but seen from the Muslim experience, Muslim perspective. The character voicing this stance is Osama ibn Munkid, the poet, courtier, and diplomat from Syria, who served in Egypt as advisor to one of the last viziers of the Fatimid regime. Dispatched from Cairo to negotiate an anti-Crusader alliance with other Muslim regional powers, and having failed, Osama is then found to have been caught himself in a battle against the Crusaders in Ascalon on his return to Egypt. There are also animations. I mean, two here to mention. One where an animated, Imam Khalif al-Muizz is shown to invent the fountain pen, and another one. It's fun. It's quite funny because it's a rather upset child, the Imam Khalif al-Hakim, throwing a tantrum. I'll speed up. There are the digital. These are illustrations. There is a vast range of illustrated books where the Fatimids are now represented. These artists go to extreme lengths to research and be accurate about what it is that they draw. You can see one of the gates in Cairo. We can see the parasol. It's quite correct in the way in which, at least, sources represent, the way in which the Fatimid military displayed. Very quickly, the Fatimids have made a kind of large space in the game industry. Here we can see a range of games. I'm sure there are more there. There is a lot of discussion about the Fatimids in fanzines that grow around gamers. Gamers organize themselves in fanzines, and there are hundreds and hundreds of discussions about how to be best at representing oneself as a Fatimid when you play as a Fatimid in this game as a gamer. And the answers tend to be quite correctly. So someone somewhere looks at what we write and what we put out there, and then draws information, because I check the answers and the information, and they are quite accurate, I would say. So what to make of all these resources in view of understanding, beside and beyond academia, the place the Fatimids and the Ismailis in general. There is one game that centers around the Sulahids, and the Queen Arwa is a mod, so we can play these games as taking this persona if we want to. So who would have said, the Sulahids having a popular following in the realm of game. So beside academia, the place of the Fatimids and Ismaili in general occupy in contemporary global and popular culture. So fiction produced in all its modes offer boundary-free, immersive pedagogical opportunities, can illuminate on today's perspective and uses of the past, attract new, diverse, pluralistic audiences to historical debate. Fiction offers the opportunity to shift across diverse histories and societies for solace as much as for ideological reasons. Within an Islamic framework, we see that while in many instances Islamic history and doctrines are presented as monolithic and stereotypical, in many cases stories centered around the Fatimids can serve to challenge that very perception. These experiences of the past can in turn impact the present in a real way. On the one hand, we witness an engagement with an Islamic dynasty and an age noted for tolerance, inclusivity, intellectualism, promotion of the arts. On the other, this very engagement can lead to the perpetuation of stereotypes, the sect factor, the mystery around esoteric doctrines, the trope of the mad caliph, the perceived hedonistic lifestyle, and decadence. Warfare typically frames a fiction featuring the Fatimids. With that memory of old rivalries and religion-inspired conflict needs to be perpetuated. In challenging a cultural homogenization that tends to subsume diverse cultures under dominant models, exploring modern and contemporary fiction offered the opportunity to observe how and possibly address how the Fatimids and Ismailis with them are represented to today broad audiences and thus add a new divergent voice to current debates on representation and of Arabs and Muslims. Just 1 second, I made an experiment. I put the content of my paper and some prompts, some elements of some themes from the conference, and I've inputted these words to a system where artificial intelligence can turn these prompts into images. And these are the images of the conference according to artificial intelligence. Let's see what. So this is what the conference. This is what happens when you put Ismaili, Fatimids, I tried various styles, and these are non-fungible token art pieces. So this is I think this is the mystery, the esoteric thing. Then obviously there is a kind of exotic landscape reminiscent. But the last one, that was a surprising. There's this combative woman. Anyway, in case you are wondering what this is my investment into buying soldiers. And it's very good quality. I've been told that this is accurate, that the shield is accurate, but then I was told that the sword is wrong. So I bought another one with the right sword, which should be straight and not curved. But the quality wasn't quite as good. And just to make sure, Fatimid Caliphal Guard, so it's the real thing, it's okay. So this is what happens when you are locked, in lockdown for 2 years.
Thank you very much.